Okay, let's dive deep into this. Imagine it. November 24th, 1971.
Uh-huh. The night before Thanksgiving.
Exactly. A seemingly unremarkable man walks up to the Northwest Orient ticket counter in Portland, Oregon.
Right. Pays cash, just $20 for a one-way ticket to Seattle.
Uses the name Dan Cooper. A simple transaction, the kind that happened thousands of times a day back then.
Totally. Pre-security checkpoint era, no ID needed, nothing.
But this particular passenger and this particular flight, they were about to launch one of the most perplexing, really enduring mysteries in modern history.
And yeah, thanks to that newspaper misprint, he became known to everyone as D.B. Cooper.
Forever.
D.B. Cooper, it's wild how that stuck.
What's truly fascinating, I think, is how this event wasn't just a crime. It became this huge cultural phenomenon.
Right.
It was a skyjacking, sure, but executed with this, almost theatrical flair.
Yeah.
Culminating in that jump into the utter darkness of a November night and then just gone, vanished.
And that disappearance has stumped investigators for, over 50 years now? Over 50 years. And the lack of a resolution is exactly why it still resonates so strongly, I think.
And you, our listener, have provided us with this really rich collection of sources, articles, investigative reports, even personal research notes, digging into every single angle of this case.
Yeah, a lot of material to go through.
So our mission today is to kind of act as your guides, to pull out the most important bits of knowledge and insight from your material.
We're not just retelling the story people already know.
No, exactly. We're analyzing the facts presented in your sources, looking at the conflicting theories, trying to understand why this puzzle just remains stubbornly unsolved.
We'll look at the meticulous and sometimes, contradictory details of that day.
The strange stuff Cooper had with him.
Right, the mechanics and the sheer risks of that infamous jump.
And that ongoing debate. Did he survive?
Always the big question. Plus, the baffling discovery of the money years later.
Oh yeah, Tina Bar, we have to get into that.
And the relentless, yet honestly frustrating search for who he actually was, based on the evidence or, the lack of it, detailed in your sources.
Okay, let's step back into that fateful afternoon.
Let's do it.
Your sources paint a really vivid picture of the beginning. Dan Cooper, described as being, mid-40s?
Mid-40s, yeah. Dressed in a crisp black suit, white shirt, black tie.
And crucially, a clip-on tie, right? That detail becomes important later.
Very important. Dark sunglasses, black raincoat, and seen wearing brown shoes.
And this was an era, like you said, boarding a plane was just buy a ticket with cash.
Simple as that. No ID required, no metal detectors. He just walked right onto Northwest Orient Flight 305.
It's kind of hard to imagine air travel being that casual now, isn't it?
Completely different world. He boarded that 727, which surprisingly was only about a third full.
Even though it was the night before Thanksgiving, busy travel day.
Yeah, kind of strange, but maybe lucky for him. He settled into seat 18C.
Which gave him some space, probably helped him blend in initially.
Ordered a bourbon and soda, lit up a Raleigh cigarette. Just seemed like a, typical businessman flying between cities.
Right. Until...
the note. Until the moment he handed that note to Florence Schaffner, the stewardess closest to him.
And your sources mention her first reaction. She kind of thought he was hit on her.
Yeah, maybe trying to pass her his phone number or something. She actually just dropped it into her purse without even looking at it.
Wow. But he wasn't interested in that at all.
No. He leaned in quietly and said, "Miss, you better look at that. I have a bomb."
Chilling. That must have been absolutely terrifying.
Absolutely. Florence got the note out. Your source's detail. It was handwritten, all in capital letters. Even Miss was in caps.
And she had to transcribe it. Why?
Northwest Orient's company policy back then was apparently not to accept notes directly from passengers. Weird, I know. So she had to write down what it said.
And the key message was?
Basically, his demands and the fact that he claimed to have a bomb.
And then he showed her, or at least showed her something.
Yes. He opened his briefcase, just enough for her to see inside. The description she gave, which is detailed in your sources.
What did she see?
Wires and red sticks taped together. One source even specifies the sticks look about 6 inches long.
And the power source?
A battery. Tina Mucklow, another stewardess who spent hours with him later, described it as being about as thick as her arm.
Whoa.
Your sources identify this as a D-cell, but specifically a number 6 dry cell battery, which is like a much bigger, heftier type than your standard D-cell, known for delivering significant power.
And he was holding a wire?
A stripped red wire, yeah.
Yeah.
Claiming that touching it to a contact point would detonate the device and kill everyone.
Okay, so this is where the sources really start to diverge, right?
Hmm.
Was that bomb real or fake?
This is a huge question. And yeah, the material you provided presents compelling arguments for both sides. It's really interesting.
What's the argument for it being real?
Well, the argument for it being potentially real, as detailed in one source, is that dynamite was surprisingly easy to get back then.
Really? Like hardware stores?
Apparently so. And that type of battery he showed, that number 6 dry cell, it could absolutely provide enough current to ignite blasting caps if real explosives were there.
Huh.
One expert mentioned actually recreating the device based on the description and confirmed, yeah, it could work. And the FBI, initially, they had to treat it as real for safety. They even looked into recent dynamite thefts in the area.
Makes sense. But the counter-arguments from other sources are pretty strong too, weren't they?
They are. Several sources highlight that hijackers back then often just claimed to have a bomb. You didn't actually need one.
Just the threat was enough.
Exactly. Showing a fake was common because no airline crew would risk calling that bluff. And Cooper's display, it was described as possibly the most elaborate fake seen in these kinds of incidents.
And more convincing than usual.
Yeah, it looked convincing enough to get what he wanted without necessarily needing actual explosives. Those red sticks. Could have been anything under a thin red covering, flare tubes, wood.
And Tina Mucklow's background that plays into this too.
It does. Tina's father was reportedly an electrician. So the idea is that her detailed description of the stripped wire and the specific battery might have been more technically informed than, say, an average person's.
Meaning she recognized it looked plausible.
Right, which adds weight to the idea that the display was designed to look technically sound, whether it was real or not.
Some sources also speculate maybe if it was real, it was like a last resort, a
Yeah.
suicide device if he got cornered.
That's a possibility raised, yeah. Consistent with him reportedly saying he wouldn't be taken alive. But ultimately, we just don't know.
But fake or real, it worked. He got his demands met.
Precisely. His demands were very specific. $200,000 in cash.
All in $20 bills.
All 20s. 4 parachutes, 2 main and 2 reserve. And for the plane to be refueled and directed to Mexico City.
And they landed in Seattle, the passengers were let go, and they delivered the money in parachutes. That part seemed to go off without a hitch.
It did. Very smooth exchange on the tarmac. But, beyond the briefcase with the supposed bomb, the sources describe other items Cooper had with him, or acquired. And these offer more clues. Or maybe just more questions.
Okay, let's unpack the other stuff he had. There's this mysterious green bag mentioned.
Ah, yes, the mystery bag. Your sources describe it as a plastic green shopping bag, about the size of a dress shirt box.
Oh.
What's fascinating, is detailed in your material, is how few people actually saw it. Only 3 witnesses.
Who were they?
Tina Mucklow saw him with it after he'd been in the lavatory. Nancy House, another flight attendant, saw him with it leaving the lavatory earlier. And Bill Mitchell, a college kid sitting across the aisle, saw it under Cooper's seat at some point.
But the other crew members didn't see it initially.
Crucially, no. Crew members like Florence Schaffner and Alice Hancock, who interacted with him a lot when he first boarded, or while he was seated before things really kicked off, they never saw him with this bag.
So where did it come from? And why was it under his seat, according to that one witness?
Well, one theory mentioned in the sources is that it might have been inside his briefcase initially.
Ah, okay.
Tina described the bomb apparatus as only taking up a corner of the briefcase, leaving quite a bit of room. So the bag, described as having some bulk, could maybe have been used to fill space, keep the bomb stuff from shifting.
And then he took it out later.
Possibly. Took it out maybe in the lavatory and then stashed it under his seat. The timing Mitchell describes fits with that possibility.
And the contents. Total mystery, right, leading to all sorts of speculation in the sources.
Exactly. The key point highlighted is that whatever was in that bag, it wasn't used during the hijacking itself.
So it was probably for the jump. Or the escape afterwards.
That's the strong implication. Speculation runs wild.
Mm.
A flashlight, maybe? Though one expert kind of dismissed that, thinking Cooper would be too tempted to use it, which would make him visible during a night jump.
Good point. What else?
Maybe a canteen for water, perhaps a pistol. One expert noted he'd definitely want one if he were Cooper, which made me chuckle.
Yeah, probably.
Gloves, goggles, maybe boots, or long johns for warmth. The bag's size, roughly briefcase height, but bit less long, could probably fit some of those things.
Okay. He also had his cigarettes and matches. Anything significant there?
Well, he smoked Raleigh cigarettes. That's a specific detail from your material.
Yeah.
And he used matches. Apparently, he ran out of Sky Chef matches. Yeah, those came from a restaurant at the Portland airport, PDX. The detail is interesting because it suggests he'd had those matches for a little while.
Implying maybe he was a frequent flyer out of Portland, or at least had been there recently.
Possibly. It's a small clue, but it hints at a potential local connection or travel pattern.
And the other matchbook, the International Correspondence School one.
Ah, yeah. Those IC matchbooks were apparently everywhere back then, like ubiquitous advertising. Think AOL CDs in the mail in the late 90s.
Gotcha. So having one doesn't really narrow anything down.
Probably not much about him specifically, though one source does point out the ironic slogan on the cover, increase your earning power fast.
Say, darkly funny, given the circumstances. What about the Benzedrine?
Right. Your sources mentioned Cooper having what's described as an Adderall-type product, Benzedrine,
Well,
which may have been illegal by then, possibly became controlled around 69 or 70.
and he offered it to the crew.
Yeah, said something like he knew they were tired, but they turned him down. This detail, it's cited by one source referencing Richard Tosaw's book and an interview with Bill Radich.
And he had a pocket knife.
Yes, he was seen using a pocket knife when he was messing with the parachutes on the plane, cutting some lines, apparently.
Okay. Finally, let's just quickly revisit his clothes, especially the shoes, thinking about the jump.
Right. So he wore that black rain-type overcoat over his suit for the initial flight. Tina Mucklow, the last crew member to see him up close, saw him strapped into the parachute harness, still wearing his suit.
But the big question is, what did he actually wear when he jumped?
Exactly. There's that crucial uncertainty. Your sources describe his shoes as not being loafers, that they went up over his ankles.
So maybe boots? Or something sturdier?
Could be. Could fit hiking boots or some other solid footwear, maybe better for landing or walking in rough terrain, even if they weren't, like, obviously, military or parachuting boots.
And there's speculation he might have added layers, like long johns from the mystery bag.
That's the idea. Or maybe change shoes during that 30 minutes he spent alone in the back getting ready. We only know the last description the crew had was him in the suit.
So the classic image is the suit and tie, but it's definitely plausible he had more practical gear ready for the jump itself.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah. Especially considering that mystery bag and its potential contents.
Okay, now we move to the critical moment. The jump into the unknown.
Right. After getting the ransom and parachutes in Seattle, Cooper gave the flight crew his instructions for the next leg, heading south.
Low and slow, right.
Exactly. He specified a low altitude, around 10,000 feet, and a slow speed, under 200 knots. And crucially, he knew about the rear air stairs on the Boeing 727.
That specific feature.
Yeah, really distinctive feature of that plane model. And he ordered them lowered while the plane was still in flight. That was something very few people, maybe not even all pilots, knew was actually possible on the 727 he'd chosen.
He needed help actually lowering them.
Yes. And this is one of those confounding contradictions in his behavior, as your sources put it. It's really weird.
Oh, so.
He had this, like, abstract knowledge of the plane's specific capabilities. And the ideal flight conditions for a jump, low and slow, suggests he knew something about parachuting from a plane.
Right. Sounds knowledgeable.
But then he needed Tina Mucklow to physically show him or help him with the mechanism to lower the stairs. It involved releasing a lock and pushing against the wind resistance. It wasn't just a simple button.
So he knew what was possible, but maybe not the how.
Exactly. That mix of knowing the theory but maybe lacking the practical hands-on execution makes profiling him so damn difficult.
Okay, so the stairs are down. He sent Tina back to the cockpit and spent about 30 minutes alone back there before he jumped. What was he doing?
Yeah, that 30-minute period is prime territory for speculation. He's alone in the rear cabin, totally out of sight of the crew.
Getting ready.
That's the main theory. Getting fully ready for the jump, strapping on the parachute correctly. Securing the money somehow, maybe adding those layers or changing shoes from the mystery bag.
Or maybe just psyching himself up.
That's the other possibility mentioned in your sources, simply working up the nerve. Some experts point out that a highly trained, experienced parachutist, especially one with a clear escape plan, would likely jump almost immediately once the stairs were down and conditions were right.
The delay could suggest hesitation.
Could suggest hesitation, yeah.
Right.
Or maybe just meticulous last-minute prep. Or it could point to a lack of practical jump experience where that moment of commitment is a bigger hurdle. We just don't know.
Now, he had 4 parachutes delivered, but your sources clarify he didn't actually jump with all of them, or even 2, right?
Correct. That's a common misconception. He received 2 main parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes. According to your sources, He selected one main parachute and one reserve parachute to potentially jump with, leaving the other main and the other reserve on the plane.
But wait, one of the reserves was useless.
Yes, this is a crucial detail found in your material. One of the reserve chutes he was given was actually a dummy chute. It was designed for ground training, like practicing pulling the cord.
So it looked real, but wasn't functional for a jump.
It was technically operable, it would open, but it lacked the necessary D-rings to actually attach it to the main parachute harness. You couldn't use it as a backup in the air.
Does Cooper realize that?
It suggests maybe he didn't inspect the parachutes that closely, or perhaps he didn't fully understand how a reserve system integrates with a main. Or maybe he never intended to use the reserve anyway.
And the FBI thought he threw stuff out beforehand.
Yeah, the FBI later believed he probably tossed his briefcase, and possibly that dummy reserve parachute, out the rear stairs at some point before he actually jumped himself. Maybe to lighten his load or just get rid of incriminating stuff.
Okay, so what about the main parachute he did use for the jump?
It's described in your sources as an MB-8 parachute. It had a 24-foot canopy.
And it wasn't exactly top of the line.
No, definitely not. It's characterized as a basic, even inferior or cheap bailout rig. Think emergency escape, not sport parachuting.
What were its characteristics?
Unlike modern, highly steerable sport chutes, the MB-8 was primarily designed just to open quickly and reliably, even if the person jumping was tumbling or in an unstable freefall.
Could you steer it at all?
It had what's called a 4-line release system. You could pull on 4 specific shroud lines on one side. Doing that would cause the canopy to sort of turn into the wind.
So not full steering, but some control.
Yeah, a little bit. Enough to potentially reduce your horizontal speed right before landing, and maybe make it a bit softer. But it wasn't agile, and one source notes it was packed by the same rigor as the other, so it should have been functional, assuming he used it correctly.
Okay, so how did the actual jump happen from the perspective inside the plane?
Your sources describe the stairs being lowered, held down partly by gravity against that strong wind resistance. When Cooper jumped off,
His weight was gone.
exactly, his
Yeah.
weight was suddenly removed, and the wind pressure instantly slammed the stairs back up against the fuselage. Hard.
And the crew felt that.
Yeah, it created a noticeable change in air pressure inside the cabin.
Yeah.
You felt it often called a pressure bump, or like a diving board effect.
But no one saw him actually go?
No, he was back there alone. Tina had been sent to the cockpit. They just felt that jolt, and they knew he must have jumped around then.
So the crew knew roughly when he jumped based on that jolt, but they couldn't know precisely where he was over the ground at that moment.
Precisely. The suspected jump zone, based on the flight path calculations and when the crew thought they felt that jolt, is generally placed near Ariel, Washington.
Which is what kind of terrain?
Dense, rain-soaked forests. Pretty rugged, relatively close to the Columbia River. But here's the kicker. There was triple cloud cover below the plane at 10,000 feet.
Meaning he couldn't see the ground at all?
Zero visibility below him. He was essentially jumping blind, just winging his drop zone, as one source put it. He couldn't pick out a field or a road or anything, just jumping into the clouds and hoping for the best.
And even the exact timing of the jump based on that jolt is debated.
Yeah, your sources note this uncertainty. While the crew felt the pressure change, one source points out he might not have actually gone out the door for another, say, 5 minutes after that jolt was felt.
Why would that matter?
Well, a 5-minute difference at that speed could shift the estimated landing spot by 5 to 10 miles further down the flight path. That significantly changes where you'd even start searching on the ground. The precise timing and location, somewhere in Clark County, Washington, are still debated intensely by Cooper enthusiasts.
Okay, let's recap that jump. Nighttime. Triple cloud cover, so blind jump, over unknown, potentially treacherous forested terrain, with a basic, non-steerable parachute, and maybe without full cold weather or landing gear. That sounds incredibly risky.
It absolutely does.
Mhm.
And that mix of his, again, abstract knowledge, knowing about the 727 stairs, the low, slow flight profile, combined with this potential lack of practical experience or proper gear, it makes the whole plan seem, as your sources put it, confounding or incongruent,
Smart in some ways.
and seemingly really haphazard or dangerously naive in others.
Which naturally leads us right to the core, persistent question that just defines this whole mystery. Where did he go? Did D.B. Cooper survive that jump, or did he perish shortly after hitting the ground, or even before?
This is the 50-year debate, isn't it? And your sources provide really strong arguments for both outcomes. It leaves the question just wide open.
Okay, let's lay out the arguments presented in your sources that lean towards Cooper's death. What are the main points?
The primary arguments really revolve around those harsh conditions and his potentially inadequate preparation, like we just said. Night jump, cold, wet weather into incredibly dense, heavily forested terrain with significant unknown elevation changes.
Not exactly ideal landing conditions.
Not even close. Not safe for any parachutist, let alone someone who might have had limited practical experience.
And his gear, or lack thereof, adds to that risk.
Absolutely. Your sources really highlight the dangers of using that basic, non-steerable parachute and potentially wearing just a suit and overcoat. Yeah. If he didn't have specialized gear like a helmet or an altimeter to even know his altitude in the dark, or sturdy boots if those weren't in the mystery bag,
It wasn't a controlled sport jump?
not at all. It was a blind bailout into really difficult terrain. Experts quoted in your sources describe it as incredibly risky, maybe even a ballsy jump, but not a carefully calculated maneuver by a seasoned pro who minimizes risk.
Okay, risky jump. But maybe the most compelling argument for his death is simply he's never been found.
Right.
That's the stark reality, isn't it? Zero trace. Of D.B. Cooper himself, of the main parachute he jumped with, of the briefcase he supposedly tossed out, or the overwhelming majority of that $200,000 ransom. Nothing has ever been definitively found in over 5 decades of searching related to the jump itself. But couldn't that incredibly difficult terrain just make it impossible to find anything? People get lost in woods like that all the time.
That's true. And finding a body or small items in thick, remote forests is extremely difficult. Your sources mention a parallel case, James Annis.
Yeah, the teenage hunter.
Right. Disappeared in the same county, the same month as Cooper. A year later, searchers found only his rifle and a few scattered bones. Animals had, done their work relatively quickly. So finding Cooper's body might be nearly impossible if he landed deep in the woods and died there.
But the area wasn't that remote, was it?
That's the counterpoint. While rural and forested, the suspected jump zone isn't entirely remote wilderness. It's bordered by roads, farms, towns, and it's seen considerable development and logging over the last 50 years.
So the lack of any discovery.
Exactly. No tangled parachute canopy caught in trees, no discarded briefcase fragments, no skeletal remains ever turning up accidentally by hikers or loggers. It's noted by experts in your sources as extremely strange. Statistically improbable, maybe, if he had simply landed and perished right there in the general search area. Something should have turned up eventually, you'd think.
And the money never showing up in circulation, that points to death too, potentially.
It could. The vast majority of that ransom money, which had recorded serial numbers, has never surfaced in any legitimate way.
So maybe he died before he could spend it.
That's one interpretation. He died shortly after landing and never got the chance. Or the alternative is he knew it was hot money, too risky to use, and either hid it permanently or just lived off other means. Though one source does caution that unless large sums were deposited or used at specific places like casinos, routine checks of serial numbers on everyday 20s weren't really a thing back then.
There's also that statistical analysis mentioned in one source.
Yeah, one expert did a statistical analysis based on known skyjacking cases, and their model suggested something like an 82% chance of survival for a jump like this.
That sounds pretty high, actually.
It does, but then another perspective offered in the sources is a bit counterintuitive. If you apply this to the really small pool of actual copycat hijackers who tried similar jumps later.
The ones who got caught.
Right. They all survived their jumps and were eventually caught. So the argument goes, maybe Cooper, the one who wasn't caught, is statistically the anomaly, the one who didn't make it. It's a small data set, so it's hard to draw firm conclusions.
Okay, those are definitely powerful arguments pointing towards his demise, especially the complete lack of evidence. But the case is still debated because there are also compelling arguments for his survival, right? Based on the sources.
Absolutely. And the strongest argument for survival, repeated in the material you provided, is a really simple logical one.
Which is?
Cooper demonstrably opened a parachute on the plane. He pulled the ripcord on that dummy reserve chute he handled briefly. So why would he go through all the trouble of hijacking a plane, demanding a main parachute, strapping it on, jumping out, only to fail to pull the cord on the main chute when it actually mattered?
It seems unlikely he'd forget the most crucial step.
Exactly. The MB-8 rig was designed for reliability. It should have opened even if he was panicked or tumbling. Experts quoted find it almost extraordinary to just assume he didn't pull the cord on the main chute he jumped with. Pulling the cord is one of the few positive actions we can reasonably assume he took.
Okay, so assume the chute opened. Even with a potentially hard landing, survival was still possible.
Definitely possible.
Yeah.
A rough landing could certainly cause injury, sure. A broken leg, broken ankle, one source speculates that could even be why he disappeared. Maybe he was immobilized, waiting for help that never came, or just trying to crawl out slowly.
But the area wasn't completely impossible to get out of.
No. Like we said, while forested, it's bordered by roads, farms, small towns. It's rural, but not like deep Alaskan wilderness.
Uh,
An injured person could conceivably still make their way toward civilization, find help, or even just be found eventually if they were alive for a while near a trail or something.
And a deployed parachute itself, that's a big visible object, isn't it? Shouldn't that have been found if he landed and died nearby?
Precisely. That's a huge point. If he survived the jump and the parachute deployed properly, that large canopy, maybe 24 feet across, draped over trees or lying on the ground, is a very visible object, especially from the air during searches.
So if he landed, maybe got injured, and died right there.
You'd expect the parachute to have been found eventually, even years later, unless he somehow managed to gather it all up and hide it effectively while potentially injured, which seems difficult. The lack of finding the parachute itself is a really significant point that supports both sides of the survival debate, weirdly enough.
How so?
If he died, where's the chute? If he survived and escaped, how did he hide the chute so well? It's a puzzle piece that doesn't fit easily.
There's also the possibility that his escape plan was just better than we assume, more robust than just the jump itself.
Yes, that's the other main survival argument presented in your sources. Maybe the jump wasn't the end of the plan, but just one step.
Like he had help waiting.
Maybe. Perhaps he planned for a pickup by car on a nearby logging road, or had arranged other transportation. Especially if he managed to jump closer to a road, or even, as one source suggests, makes tactical sense, maybe he aimed further back towards the Portland area where he started.
Somewhere more familiar.
Possibly. Or he could have buried the money temporarily, planning to come back for it. Maybe he had a rendezvous point with an accomplice or a hidden cabin or location planned out. In that scenario, the lack of evidence isn't because he died in the woods.
It's because his escape actually worked.
Exactly. And the search was either looking in the wrong place or just wasn't thorough enough, or couldn't possibly find his hidden trail or buried cache.
So we're left with this central paradox. The absolute lack of physical evidence from the jump zone strongly suggests death.
Right.
But basic logic about parachute use, plus the possibility of a successful planned disappearance, equally support survival.
That's precisely it. The emptiness of that search area is the biggest clue we have, but we still don't definitively know what that emptiness really signifies.
Yeah.
It's maddening.
Which brings us, inevitably, to the one confirmed piece of physical evidence that did turn up years later and somehow managed to add yet another layer of baffling complexity. The money found at Tina Bar.
Oh man, Tina Bar. This is such a truly bizarre twist in the case.
Yeah.
Okay, so fast forward to 1980, nearly 9 years after the hijacking.
9 years. Wow.
An 8-year-old boy, Brian Ingram, is playing on this beach area known as Tina Bar. It's a sandbar on the north bank of the Columbia River. Importantly, it's downstream from the generally accepted suspected jump zone.
Okay, downstream, and he's just playing.
Yeah, apparently raking sand to clear a spot for a family campfire, and he uncovers these 3 bundles of cash. Old, degraded $20 bills.
And the total was?
$5,800.
Yeah, and these bills, they were confirmed to be part of Cooper's ransom money.
Absolutely. The FBI checked the serial numbers against the list they'd recorded from the ransom package given to Cooper in Seattle. They were a definitive match. No question.
So finally, concrete proof linking something found on the ground years later directly back to the hijacking. This must have blown the case open, right?
You'd think so, but no. This discovery didn't really solve the core mystery. It just seemed to create a whole new set of equally puzzling mysteries.
Like what?
Well, first off, where's the rest of it? This was only $5,800 out of $200,000. Where was the other $194,200?
Good question.
And if this money was found here at Tina Bar, why was Cooper himself or his parachute never found anywhere near the original suspected jump zone, which was miles upstream and away from the main Columbia River channel?
Yeah, how did it get from the supposed jump area to this sandbar downstream?
And maybe most puzzlingly, how did that money, which was found still bundled and held together with the original rubber bands, even survive getting there? How did it physically get deposited on Tina Bar?
Tina Bar. It's downstream from where the Washougal River flows into the Columbia, right? And that Washougal River drainage basin was part of the broader search area.
Correct. But it still wasn't the primary focus of the initial ground search for Cooper himself. So, your sources discuss various theories presented over the years for how the money might have traveled there. The simplest idea is, well, it just washed down the river system somehow.
Oh, wait, you said the bundles were still together. Don't wads of cash just sink when they get wet? Money doesn't float, does it?
That's the major counterargument, yeah. Highlighted in the sources. Experiments simulating bundles of cash getting wet show they absorb water and sink pretty quickly. Paper gets heavy.
So how did these bundles stay together, reportedly still in their original stacking order from the bank, with rubber bands partially intact?
Right. How did they travel potentially miles through a river system, maybe tumbling along the bottom, and then get deposited relatively gently onto a sandbank years later? It really challenges that simple idea of them just falling into a river near the jump site and floating neatly downstream.
Was it maybe in some kind of container, like a bag or something that floated for a while?
That's one possibility speculated upon. Maybe it was in something buoyant, like the briefcase or another bag that eventually broke apart, releasing the bundles near Tina Bar. But there's no proof of that.
What about the theory involving a dredging operation? I remember reading about that.
Yes, that's another prominent theory discussed in your sources. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did conduct dredging operations on the Columbia River in 1974, a few years after the hijacking but before the money was found.
So the idea is they sucked it up from the river bottom.
Yeah, scooped up the money from the riverbed where it had settled and then dumped it onto Tina Bar along with all the other dredged mud and sand spoils.
Makes some sense. But there are problems with that too.
The main argument against it, cited in your sources, is the physical process of dredging. Running those bundles through powerful suction pipes, being mixed violently with mud and water, and then being forcefully expelled. It seems likely that would have just torn the bundles completely apart, not left them relatively intact, still banded.
Okay. And then there was the scientific analysis done on the bills themselves that added another layer of complexity.
This is really key. A peer-reviewed scientific study analyzed microscopic algae, called diatoms, that were found embedded in the paper fibers of the Tina Bar bills.
Diatoms, like from the river water.
Exactly. And diatoms are fascinating because different species bloom in specific times of the year and specific water conditions. The analysis revealed the presence of specific springtime diatoms on the bills.
Okay. What does that tell us specifically? Why is springtime important?
It's hugely significant because it indicates the money did not just get wet once, back in November 1971 when Cooper jumped, which is late autumn, nearly winter, and then sit buried or stationary.
So it wasn't immediately lost in the river during the jump?
The diatom evidence strongly suggests not. Finding springtime diatoms proves the money must have been exposed to Columbia River water during the spring season. Likely repeatedly over the years, it was loose in the river system before finally getting deposited on Tina Bar sometime before 1980.
So it was just tumbling around in the river, getting wet during spring floods or seasonal high water for years.
That seems to be the implication of the diatom study. It also indicated the money hadn't been deliberately buried in the sand at Tina Bar. It was washed ashore.
Wow. So the Tina Bar money, the only confirmed piece of the whole puzzle found after the event, it creates this whole separate mystery about like river hydrodynamics and microscopic algae life cycles that's almost as baffling as the main Cooper mystery itself.
It really is a perfect microcosm of the entire case's complexity, isn't it? How the money got there when it first got wet, how long it was in the river. These remain major questions raised by your sources.
One source even wonders if Cooper himself, assuming he survived, even knew how the money ended up there, or if he was just as surprised as everyone else when he saw the news about Brian Ingram's discovery 9 years later.
Yeah, it's possible. And the state of the bills and the rubber bands, degraded but still there, suggested they probably hadn't been deposited right before 1980, but have been sitting there on the beach for at least a little while.
And there was that minor detail, too, about 10 bills missing from one of the stacks found. Just another little loose end.
Exactly. Where do those 1020s go? We don't know.
So the money provides a confirmed link, but ultimately deepens the overall enigma rather than solving it.
Precisely. It confirms the hijacking and the ransom were absolutely real, but it doesn't get us any closer to solving the fate of Cooper himself or finding the rest of the money.
Given all this ambiguity, the question of who D.B. Cooper actually was remains absolutely central. Your sources mention that hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 suspects have been considered over the decades.
Yes, over 1,000 is the number cited in the material you provided. And identifying him has been incredibly challenging. partly because that initial composite sketch, based on the flight attendant's descriptions, well, it's just so generic.
Like, it could be anyone.
Pretty much. One source memorably calls it the face of everybody, not distinct enough to really narrow things down effectively.
And profiling him has been equally difficult, you mentioned earlier, because his actions seem so contradictory.
Absolutely. His behavior and his apparent knowledge, as described again and again in your sources, are called confounding, incongruent, odd, peculiar.
Smart sometimes, dumb others.
Kind of. He seemed to have that specific abstract knowledge about the 727 aircraft and the right flight conditions for a jump, but then maybe lacked the practical skills, like needing help with the stairs or possibly picking a non-optimal parachute setup.
He was polite and calm with the crew.
Yeah, remarkably so by all accounts, yet capable of meticulously planning and executing a very serious federal crime. There's also that debate about his intent to actually harm anyone, showing that bomb display even if it was fake. Maybe that was precisely calculated to achieve his demands without needing to resort to actual violence if his bluff wasn't called.
Some sources mention the idea that his persona, or how it was perceived, resonated because it sort of fit that cultural archetype of the gentleman thief.
That seems to be a common thread, yeah. Focusing on the lack of physical violence directed at the crew or passengers, despite the inherent danger and terror of the hijacking situation itself.
And then there's that really intriguing theory about where his alias and maybe even the whole plan came from, involving a comic book.
Yes, one source delves into this fascinating theory that the name Dan Cooper, and maybe even the core idea of a parachute escape from a plane, were inspired by a popular French-Canadian comic strip from that era titled Dan Cooper.
Seriously, Dan Cooper.
Yeah. The main character was a Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot who had all sorts of high-flying adventures, often involving parachuting. And apparently the cover of issue #7, which came out not long before the hijacking,
What a joke.
it notably featured the character, Dan Cooper, parachuting from a jet airplane.
Whoa, that's quite a coincidence if it is one.
It was. This theory suggests a specific, maybe kind of quirky source of inspiration for both his chosen identity and his method of escape. It's plausible, though unproven.
Okay, let's talk about some of the key suspects who have been considered over the years, based specifically on what's mentioned in your source material and why they were often looked at and then usually dismissed.
Right, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. is probably the most famous suspect. For a while, he was considered a very strong possibility, both by the public and by some within the FBI.
Why was McCoy such a focus early on? What were the similarities?
Well, your sources detail the really compelling surface similarities. Just a few months after the Cooper hijacking, in April 1972, McCoy successfully pulled off a very similar skyjacking.
Same method.
Pretty much. Demanded money, $500,000 in his case, and parachutes, and then jumped from the rear stairs of a Boeing 727 in flight. He was also described as being calm during his own heist.
And physical resemblance.
Some sources note a general physical resemblance to the Cooper sketch, and one source even mentioned that his hair parting seemed similar to how Cooper's was described. Plus, he was Mormon, had studied law at BYU. Some thought these details fit a possible profile.
Okay, sounds plausible on the surface. But the conflicting evidence, according to your sources, seems to pretty definitively rule him out now.
It really does. And this is where getting into the specific details in your material is crucial to understanding why. While the method was similar, the execution and surrounding details were different. For instance, McCoy's note to the crew during his hijacking was significantly different from Cooper's reported interaction.
That's it.
One source explicitly debunks a popular myth that both Cooper's and McCoy's notes contain the phrase, "no funny stuff." That's apparently just not true. The McCoy's actual note was reportedly much more aggressive and even included a typed message along with a picture of a grenade pin and a bullet.
So a different tone, different threat level.
Yeah, a very different communication style and threat level. According to FBI analysis cited in your sources, this difference was a major point against him being the same person, as the seemingly calmer, perhaps more calculating Cooper.
What about the claim regarding Cooper's tie? The clip-on tie found on the plane.
Yes, there was a claim mentioned in your sources, but pretty firmly dismissed by the experts cited there, that McCoy's own family later identified Cooper's recovered clip-on tie as belonging to Richard.
But that's likely not true.
One source calls it a likely Wikipedia myth. They point out that clip-on ties were extremely common back then, especially, apparently, among Mormons like McCoy. So an identification would be hard to make definitively, and crucially, it wasn't verified or substantiated by official FBI files on the recovered evidence.
Okay, but the biggest thing ruling McCoy out is his alibi, right?
That's the absolute killer argument, yes. Highlighted clearly in your sources. Richard McCoy had a verifiable alibi for November 24th, 1971, the day of the Cooper hijacking.
Where was he?
He was confirmed to be in Las Vegas on that day. And furthermore, he was confirmed to be back home with his family in Utah for Thanksgiving dinner the very next day, November 25th.
So physically impossible for him to have been on that plane out of Portland?
Exactly. He couldn't be in two places at once. Plus, unlike Cooper, McCoy was caught fairly quickly after his own hijacking. He served prison time, then famously escaped, and was later killed in a shootout with FBI agents in Virginia Beach in 1974.
So the FBI concluded he wasn't Cooper.
Experts in your sources, citing access to FBI files, state unequivocally that the Bureau concluded Richard McCoy was not D.B. Cooper. One source even suggests McCoy might have later bragged about Cooper, maybe saying Cooper should have asked for more money, possibly as a way to sort of fuzz the radar or deflect after his own capture.
Okay, so despite the tempting similarities, McCoy isn't our guy, based on the solid evidence. What about Dwayne Weber?
Dwayne Weber is another prominent suspect, but his connection comes almost entirely from a claim made by his wife after his death.
A deathbed confession.
Pretty much. His wife, Jo Weber, alleged that as Dwayne was dying in 1995, he told her, "I have a secret to tell you. I'm Dan Cooper."
Wow. Did she have anything else to back that up?
Well, as detailed in your sources, Jo Weber did come forward with other circumstantial details over the years that she felt supported the claim. Things like Dwayne apparently having recurring nightmares about leaving fingerprints behind on a plane, suffering from a persistent knee ailment that she believed he got from a rough parachute landing, finding handwriting in a library book about the Cooper case that she thought matched Dwayne's.
And the Tina Barr connection.
Yeah. Perhaps most intriguingly, she claimed that years before the money was actually found there by Brian Ingram, Dwayne had taken her to visit Tina Barr Beach, saying something cryptic about wanting to see where the money was or where he left something.
That is strange.
It is. Though one source, maybe a bit cynically, describes Jo Weber as becoming like the Forrest Gump of D.B. Cooper, because her narrative seemed to conveniently connect to almost every new detail or theory that emerged in the case over time. So, credible. Maybe, maybe not.
Okay. And what about more recent suspects, like William Smith? Are they mentioned?
William Smith is mentioned briefly in your sources as a more recent suspect, someone put forward by researchers after his death in 2018. There was a claimed physical resemblance in old photos.
Oh.
But the sources also point out significant issues, like the fact that he was apparently living 3,000 miles away on the East Coast at the time of the hijacking. It's labeled a stretch as a serious lead. It kind of highlights again how that generic sketch allows many people to appear superficially similar decades later. Your sources also touch upon the broader concept of just unidentified persons of interest, or POIs. Individuals who might have fit the general description maybe had ties to the Pacific Northwest, and who perhaps disappeared around that same time period, late 1971, early 1972. But maybe without official missing person, reports being filed until much later, or maybe never filed at all.
Like someone who just dropped off the map.
Exactly. Lee Seller is mentioned as one example name that came up in some research, reportedly scoring high on one analytical matrix comparing potential suspects. But his family apparently showed little interest when contacted, and reportedly no official death certificate or missing person record exists for him. These are individuals who match some criteria but lack any definitive link or evidence, just possibilities in the fog.
And it's important you mention that the experts in your sources also explicitly dismiss some specific theories or claims that float around.
Yes, absolutely. The material you sent makes a point of pushing back against some persistent but unsubstantiated claims. Like we said, the idea of a BYU medallion being found on the plane, often linked to McCoy, is dismissed as likely originating from internet myth, definitely not supported by the official FBI inventory records of items recovered.
And the "no funny stuff" phrase in McCoy's note?
Also explicitly refuted. And one source briefly mentions and dismisses a more recent, probably AI-generated or fake news claim about someone named William Gossip being Cooper. The experts cited in your sources really try to stick to the documented facts and evidence and debunk these less credible claims that muddy the waters.
So finding Cooper's true identity remains just incredibly difficult, partly because the initial information was limited and partly just due to the completely confounding nature of his actions and profile.
Yeah, the generic description, those contradictory aspects of his behavior, They make traditional profiling really challenging, and the sheer volume of tips, theories, suspects, and just noise over 50 years has created this incredibly dense thicket for investigators and now researchers to try and navigate.
Given all of this history, all the dead ends, what is the official status of the D.B. Cooper case from the FBI's perspective today?
Well, your sources state pretty clearly that the FBI officially closed the active investigation into the D.B. Cooper case back in 2016.
Close it, meaning they gave up.
Essentially, yes. The decision was based on the lack of credible new leads after decades of investigation and the need to allocate their limited resources to more pressing, solvable cases. It became a cold case where active investigations ceased.
But they might still look at new evidence.
They do maintain, according to your sources, that they will informally review any significant new physical evidence, like perhaps the parachute or the rest of the money if it ever turned up, or compelling scientific evidence like DNA if it emerges in the future. But they aren't actively seeking leads anymore.
While the case was active, what were some of the working assumptions or beliefs the FBI held about the case based on your sources?
Well, based on your sources, the FBI generally believed that Cooper likely did toss his briefcase, and probably that unusable dummy parachute, out of the rear stairs somewhere along the flight path before he jumped himself.
Okay.
For safety reasons during the hijacking itself, they always operated under the prudent assumption that the bomb he showed was real, even if they had doubts later.
And the Tina Bar money. What was their take on how it got there?
Regarding the Tina Bar money, the FBI's analysis, including considering the location and the diet evidence mentioned in your sources, led them to believe it had not been deliberately buried there by Cooper. Their prevailing theory leaned towards it washing into the Columbia River system somehow and eventually being deposited naturally on the sandbar.
Okay. So with the case officially closed, is there any current realistic hope for a breakthrough? Anything investigators or researchers are holding on to?
The most significant potential for a future breakthrough, as highlighted repeatedly in your sources, really lies with modern forensic science, specifically potential DNA testing.
From what?
From that black clip-on tie that Cooper apparently ripped off and left behind on his seat, 18C, on the plane. It was recovered as evidence.
And the FBI still has it?
Yes, it's still held by the FBI. The hope is that using advanced techniques that weren't available decades ago, usable DNA, maybe from skin cells trapped in the knot or on the fabric, could potentially be extracted from it.
And if they get a DNA profile?
If they get a viable profile, it could potentially be matched against suspects whose DNA might be available, or perhaps more powerfully run through familial DNA databases like those used to solve other famous cold cases that could finally point towards his family and ultimately his identity.
So that tie is really the last best physical clue.
It represents the best chance, however slim, for a definitive identification, even decades after the case went cold and was officially closed.
Okay. So what does this deep dive into your sources really tell us about the whole D.B. Cooper mystery? We've looked at the calculated audacity of the hijacking itself.
Right, the meticulous planning mixed with weird oversights.
The puzzling mix of items he carried, the bomb, the mystery bag.
The sheer undeniable risk of that night jump into the Pacific Northwest wilderness in November.
And that 50-year-plus question. Did he survive? Did he perish?
Followed by the completely unexpected and still largely unexplained discovery of just a fraction of the money 9 years later, miles away.
And finally, that elusive, frustrating search for his actual identity among countless theories, debunked suspects, and persistent myths.
It really is a case defined by its contradictions, isn't it? A man who seemed calm, polite, in control, yet possibly lacked critical practical knowledge for his plan.
A crime that seemed meticulously planned in some aspects, it culminated in what looks like a completely blind leap into the unknown.
Yeah, and a massive search effort that covered huge areas over decades, yet yielded almost nothing concrete from the event itself, save for that small amount of money that just raised more questions than it answered.
It's really no wonder this case continues to capture the public imagination after more than half a century. The elements are just so inherently dramatic, almost cinematic.
Totally. The anonymous man in the suit, the daring mid-air crime, the jump from a plane into the night, the vanished millions, and the seemingly perfect disappearance. It just ticks all the boxes for an enduring mystery.
It taps into that fascination we have with the criminal who gets away, right? The puzzle with missing pieces that feels like it should be solvable, but just isn't?
And it leaves us grappling with those fundamental questions.
Yeah.
Can he land safely somewhere, gather his loot, and just disappear into anonymity, living out his life maybe just a few states away.
Or did the harsh conditions, the potentially inadequate gear, or just a brutally rough landing claim his life out there in the dark, rainy wilderness he jumped into?
The lack of a definitive answer, that ambiguity, is precisely what keeps the legend alive and fuels endless speculation.
So now that you've explored all these sources with us, really dug into the details and contradictions, what stands out to you the most about the D.B. Cooper case? Does the evidence we've discussed, or the lack of it, lean you more towards survival? Or does that profound absence of finding anything convince you he must have perished out there?
Yeah, and based on the facts presented in your material, the strange mix in his actions and knowledge, the various suspects considered and mostly dismissed, who do you think Dan Cooper might have been? Was he ex-military? And disgruntled airline employee, just a clever opportunist, or something else entirely?
And maybe this is the final provocative thought for you to consider as you reflect on this deep dive. Given the extensive searches over so many years and the way that region has developed since 1971, does the persistent, complete absence of any trace of Cooper, his parachute, or the bulk of the money, does that absence more strongly confirm how incredibly effectively he vanished, maybe even with help?
Or does it simply underscore the argument that the conditions of that jump were so perilous that survival, and therefore leaving any trace behind to be found later, was near impossible from the start? And what do you ultimately make of that unique, separate mystery of the Tina Bar money? That one tangible piece of evidence that seems to defy simple explanation and continues to fuel its own distinct theories about the money's journey, almost independent of Cooper's own fate.
The enduring mystery of D.B. Cooper. It remains a complex, frustrating, and endlessly fascinating puzzle 50 years on, still hidden somewhere in the forests, the rivers, the archives, and the speculation, a perfect, unsolved vanishing act.